Hello and welcome back to the Who's He podcast with me, Phil, and it's a special podcast today. It's not anything Doctor Who related or Star Wars related as we've been discussing. So we'll come on to that in a minute. But joining me today, we have a special guest and an old friend of the show, J R Southall. J R, welcome back, mate.
Hello, Phil. Good to be back.
Yes, it's been a while, hasn't it? I think we I recorded with you last week for Strangers in Space, and that's the first time in a very, very long time that we've spoken, isn't it?
Not by sort of intention, though. As we'll get into, we'll find out why, because there's sort of a reason why, but it's not really anything personal, obviously.
No, obviously. No, because today what we're going to be discussing is the reasons why we got into sort of podcasting, our intentions, and how we feel it's sort of gone for us personally, and also because we've both our podcasts sort of branched out onto video as well on YouTube. So we're sort of discussing our thoughts and trials and tribulations of putting up content on that particular platform. So
the hows, the whys and the wherefores of being a podcaster in the 21st century, right?
I know, exactly. So and it has changed, because we were discussing before we start recording. I mean, our podcasts are sort of we're over a decade old now, respectively, aren't we?
We're like, this is the weird thing, isn't it? Because when you get into podcasting, there were already a load of podcasts, and you thought of yourself as the youngster, and I still think of myself as the newcomer, but actually we're the old timers, aren't we?
We are, definitely. I think it was, I mean, I started in sort of 2011, March 2011. So we've and it wasn't our intention to be doing what we're doing now. We sort of started out just wanting to be a monthly podcast, just doing audio commentaries, just a chance to myself, Paul, and our very seldom heard third member, Tony, which I don't actually think is actually an official member of the podcast anymore, to be honest with you. It was just an excuse for us to sit down and have a laugh. Paul and I were the Doctor Who fans. Tony was completely ignorant to it, and it was more sort of like, how can I put it? He was our Carl Pilkington to a to a certain degree. So yeah, it was sort of educating Tony on Doctor Who. So that was it, and it just sort of, we went to weekly in a very short space of time, actually, and then we just sort of started getting sort of trying to get guests on as well.
Because once you get into the habit of it, it becomes kind of habit forming, doesn't it? You kind of look forward to doing it, and you kind of you don't arrange your social life around it, but it certainly becomes a rock around which other things can happen, doesn't it?
Oh God, yeah. It's really peculiar, really, because I mean it sort of becomes a point of, well, I'm not podcasting this week. What am I going to do? You know, it's you get a bit lost, you set adrift somewhat. But how about yourself, Joe? What was sort of?
I didn't want to podcast. I really didn't want to podcast.
Okay.
So I had a friend, Lee, who worked in the library, and I was the postman at the library. So I used to bump into him maybe once a fortnight or maybe twice a week or something, and we would just get to talking, and every now and again he would say to me things like, you know, the way you talk, you'd be perfect for a podcast, and I'd be like, yeah, not interested. And then my other friend Mark was doing the Nerdology podcast, and he kept saying to me, you know, the way you talk, the way you just sort of rattle through ideas and stuff, you'd be perfect for a podcast. And I was like, yeah, no mate, no interest in podcasting, no, I'm just not interested. And then, because I was one of the writers at Starburst magazine, and I was doing a monthly Doctor Who column, and they had a radio show. So the editor of Starburst magazine had a radio show, which they then put on the Starburst website as a podcast, the radio show. So it wasn't really a podcast, it was a radio show. And he just emailed me one day and said, look, we want to expand the podcast on the website. We want the next one to be a Doctor Who one. Do you want to do it? And I was like, nah, mate, not interested. And then before I pressed send, I thought, hang on a second. If I say no, somebody else is going to be doing it, and I'm going to be upset about that.
Yeah, that's right.
So I just scored through it all, erased it, and said, yeah, how often do you want it?
And the rest is history, as they say. Yeah.
But then you get into conversations, don't you? So your experience was you started monthly and then went weekly. My experience was his radio show was a weekly radio show. And he said to me, we're weekly. How often do you want to do yours? Do you want it to be once a month? Every fortnight? Do you want it to be weekly?
Yeah.
And foolishly, I thought, well, if I go round, so I already had it in my head that I would get Mark and Lee involved because they've both been the ones who told me to do it. So I thought they owed it to me. So I thought if we all meet up at Mark's or Lee's or something once a week or once in a while, we can probably, 3-hour-long episodes. It's only going to take 3 hours to do, isn't it? So I thought that's what we'll do. Only so we met up the first time. And then, it was 15 minutes making a cup of tea, sitting down, setting up. Then we recorded the first one and we stopped and we all went to the toilet and I went out for a fag because I was a smoker. And then, we had to organise a few more things. So by the time we started the second one, we'd already been there for well over an hour and a half. By the time we finished the second one, this is like nearly 3 hours into the evening and we haven't even started the third one yet, by which time everyone's too tired to talk. So basically, if you listen back to our third episode, it's basically just a monologue by me, with the other two every now and again going. So I made a rod for my own back saying weekly, because we did it in person. We always did it in person. So the logistics of getting together was something we had to factor in.
Well, I think that's the point we're at as well, because I still like doing the commentaries when that was what we set out to do, and it was just the three of us in the room, huddled around a Yeti microphone that I bought, especially for the podcast. It just seemed it's quite a lot back then. It was quite a lot of money, but it seemed to be the easiest way to do it rather than buying 3 separate microphones. Because with the Yeti you can just set it to different, because it's multi-directional. So so better or worse, it kind of works. But again, as you say, it's the logistics of getting all of us together to do that. And it started out doing on Saturday evenings, then it becomes Sunday afternoons, and that would sort of flip flop about a little bit. But now it got to the point where that was sort of like a special thing to do. It's sort of like the three of us get together every few months to do a commentary. But then it was a case of, well, we lost our venue because we used to use Paul's flat to do that, but we couldn't use his flat to do it anymore. Tony just didn't have the gear to do it, so around his place or a place to do it. So when it came to when we did do the last ones we did, it was at my house, but I had to make sure my wife and children were out of the way for the evening, which is not fair, really. It really isn't. So so it just sort of fell to the wayside, really, which is it's a shame, really, because I used to get a lot of enjoyment out of doing them. I really did.
Yeah, that was one of the things I could.
I'll say whether the listeners did or not, I don't know, because we're just three of us mucking about. But
well, that was one of the things for me, is that there's not a room in this house that's big enough that has a door where I could sort of shut myself off with other people. So I was never able to host the in-person ones. I can do the Skype ones because I've got this room where I can shut myself out. But there's not enough room here for like 2 or 3 other people, so I could never host. And that was always sort of, I always felt slightly guilty about that. But then I thought, these guys, I let them be on my podcast.
Yeah, why not?
Exactly.
So I mean, I think the only reason we certainly went weekly is because I think initially we thought, well, the new series of Doctor Who is back on. Let's do it. And I think it was series
12,
6.
maybe.
Oh,
no, hang on. No, not 12. I mean, the series that was on in 2012.
In 2012,
No, it wouldn't have been, actually, would it? You would have been in for the series in 2011. So that was series 6.
Series 6, it would have been. Yeah. So I think we started on that, and I think around about the same time, I think Torchwood Miracle Day was on airing at the same time. So there was a point we were doing 2 podcasts a week. There was just a slight overlap. And it just
never do more than 1 podcast a week. That's madness.
Oh no, exactly.
Spoilers for a half an hour when we talk about.
Oh dear, what have I done? But that's how it just evolved. And I think that's the only time we are weekly now. Is when Who is on the television, or any of the respective spin-offs were on, we would cover it weekly, and that was it. So, but yeah, and then
But
now
there's a long time between then and between now, because we also have to talk about what goes on in the rest of the world of podcasts as well.
Yeah,
to talk about our story, because
it's
changed so much over that decade or so, hasn't it?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, I think when I certainly when I first started, I don't know. I think that the trigger for us really was, I think Paul and I were listening to Radio Free Skaro, and we thought, okay, that sounds like fun. We're Who fans as well. Why don't we just give it a go? But originally, it wasn't even going to be Doctor Who. We were going to do. But one of the ideas we had was to do like a news style podcast where we each pick a story from the newspapers that week, but none of us know what we're going to talk about.
Right.
So it would have been, and it wouldn't have to be anything serious. Could have been some ridiculous headline from the paper. We just discussed that. Then it turned into the old ITC programs used to show on ITV4 back in the day, and they still do show them, but it used to be all of them used to be on, like the Champions, the Baron, you name it. They're all, your Man in the Suitcase. They were all Hot Kirk. They were all on there. But then we just settled, let's do a Doctor Who one. And again, it wasn't really our intention, but that's what we did. So when I set it up, I thought, where do you advertise? Where do you advertise your podcast? So I set up my Twitter handle. And then at the time, you used to go to the Doctor Who Podcast Alliance. That was where you used to, and I can't even remember how I stumbled across that particular group, but I got myself set up on there. And that was it. Off we went. But then you looked at the list of podcasts, there are about 80 odd.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, Doctor Who, and it was increasing daily. It was incredible. And there was a lot of North American podcasts as well. I thought, okay, it wasn't seen as a little peculiar British show. And I think it was that Radio Free Skaro effect, I think, got people just doing it. And
I've got a theory about the big difference between North American and European ones. But
okay, we'll come on to that. Yeah, but I was going to say, I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of those podcasts in those early days, they've just gone. They're not there anymore. Yeah.
Well, that was the thing about the Doctor Who Podcast Alliance, wasn't it? You go down the list and there's 80 podcasts.
Yeah.
And underneath each one, it's got some stats, including when the most recent episode came out.
Yeah.
And as you went down the list, increasingly you were finding 2 years ago, a year ago, 6 months ago, 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, I mean, somebody came to us once, I remember, and said, "Oh, I love what you do. I should set my own podcast up." And I'm like, "Yeah, go for it."
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So he recorded one episode and then thought, "No, it's not for me." And that was it.
That was it. Yeah. Yeah. I think we'll sort of skip it. I'll come on to what I think about the state of podcasting is now a bit later, I think, actually. But yeah, I think as it went on, I sort of like, okay, I need to, certainly when we're doing the commentaries, but we can't just keep sitting huddling around the table for 2 to 3 hours. It's a bit cramped, a bit uncomfortable. So then I thought, like, let's go down the route of having individual microphones. I ended up buying a mixing desk then I bought some condenser mics to go with it, which I'm still using now, actually. And just sort of try and improve the quality a little bit. And I don't know if that's what's the sort of the actual quality. Audio quality. Are you a big audiophile? That's the
not
thing.
Really. But then I have a thought about that.
Yeah.
Which sort of plays into what I was saying about there's a difference between American ones and British ones, and a sort of a theory. And my theory is this, and this sort of like, I can back this up as well with a few examples, which I suppose are sort of, they're just examples that I've noticed. But so the radio is the thing that's been around for like a century.
Yeah.
And people have the radio playing in the corner of the room, like a television set, and they're listening from across the room, or they're at work and it's playing at work. And so they're listening in the workplace, in an office or a factory or a warehouse or something, and the radio's playing. And you need to be able to hear what the people on the radio are saying, despite the fact that there's the hubbub of conversation and machinery and everything else. And so the voices on a radio need to be really compressed, fat voices. if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So that even if you can't really hear it terrifically well, you can follow the conversation and you can hear what the voices are saying. And the thing about radio as well, then, is it becomes a sort of declamatory medium where the DJ or the presenter or the sort of newsreader or whatever has to project into this sort of space where the radio is happening, even though at that end they can't see it. They know that's what they're doing. So the technology and the presenting style for radio is set up to be declaiming into a space where various numbers of people will be listening in to try and pick up on what's being said.
Yeah.
A podcast goes to a single person in a pair of earbuds direct into their brain.
Yeah.
It is an entirely different medium. And of course, I remember when I first started, Mark and Lee had both said to me, the great thing about podcasting is it's just like overhearing a conversation that a couple of people might be having in a pub. And that's what you do. You like have a conversation and somebody downloads your podcast and listens to it. And it's like they're just listening to you have a chat. So it becomes a completely different thing where it's not declamatory at all. I remember just a few weeks ago, because I listen to a lot of politics and news and current affairs, and one of the BBC podcasts, they did Americast, which was John Sopel and Emily Maitlis, and then Sopel and Maitlis left and went to work for BT doing a podcast there.
Okay.
And a new team came in to do the Americast. Then a short break, and then a new team came in. And one of the new guys, Justin, his surname's gone out of my head, he came in from the radio. And so on the first episode, he comes into the studio and he's declaiming in a presenting style for the radio. And I remember he came back on the second episode a week later and he made plenty of mention of the fact that he'd been ticked off by all the listeners and the producers and everybody else at the BBC because you're making a podcast, mate, not a radio show. You're not presenting, you're chatting for the listeners to hear.
Yeah.
And so that's always been my thing is it doesn't really matter what the sound quality is like. But what I tell you what I really don't like when I listen to a podcast is if the presenter's ear, the host's voice is right up close and personal in my ear. I'd rather have a microphone in the middle of the room and the voices are a little bit distant around it because that's what it's like when you're listening to somebody's conversation, right?
Yeah.
That's what it's like when you're hearing people talk. So I don't like it to be too overproduced. I think if it's too overproduced, it forgets what being a podcast is all about.
Yeah, I think because I must admit, I did when we got to the point.
Because I'm looking at, I've
got the mic right in front of me.
Carry on.
Yeah,
you've got the microphone in front of you, but you're not right up on it.
No.
If you were right up on that mic, your voice would be so big in the microphone that it would be giving me a headache in my ear, and that's the big difference.
I know. I think because I did sort of when I went to this sort of form of recording, I did look up. Okay, what's the best way to set up? And I've got a smaller sort of mixing desk that I'm using to connect the mic and the laptop through. I thought, what's the best setup for it? And I looked at loads of different. There's loads of instructional YouTube videos. I mean, if you're thinking of getting into podcasting, it's all out there for you. But some have got the mic right up here, like they are presenting a radio show. They've got it on a boom arm. It's in front of them, hanging down in front of their face. And they sort of, you get to this level and that level, and then you should be able to, like, that's it. It's the perfect thing. Well, it's not for everybody.
No.
And it all depends on your voice. Because I haven't naturally got a quiet voice. If I talk, it's at full volume. Right. I'm very easy to pick out in a pub. If the pub is crowded, there's Phil. You can hear my voice coming from from across a crowded room.
I think I'm the same, to be honest. So
yeah. So I thought that doesn't work for me. So the setup I've got now, it works. But even then, I still run a macro in Audacity to set the optimum thing. So if it peaks too much, it sort of puts a bit more treble and bass, it's sort of a bit of compression, just the volume, and to me that's fine. So as you say, it's not as if I'm leaning right into yes, I'm not leaning right into the mic.
What I do, because when we record, you're the same as me. We record all the voices individually and stick them together in the edit. Yeah. And what I do is I do exactly what you say. I sort of it doesn't flatten them out, but what it does is it just brings them into line with each other.
Yeah.
And then you can sort of re-amplify and use the gain controls as well to make sure everybody's at about the same volume or volume densities rather than volume.
That's right.
So it doesn't matter if somebody's quieter, but if they're speaking more loudly, then they can be, but it's about a volume density.
It is.
And it's trial and error picking it out, but you do it.
Oh, it is. I mean, so sometimes I listen. I very rarely. I don't know about you, Joe. I very rarely listen back to anything I've recorded.
No.
Yeah, because I don't like the sound of my own voice. So it's bad enough listening to me now. I've listened to it again when I'm editing. And I thought I sure as I don't listen to a third time when I put it online. So but now and again I do, and I think, oh, the sound quality is really bad there, especially in the early days when I wasn't really that clued up on it, really. Because I mean, to me, back then, sort of podcasting, it literally was, as you say, it's different to radio, but it seemed to be like guerrilla radio making, if you see what I mean, because it was for the amateur. I always felt podcasting, because it was the people who didn't have a voice on radio, didn't have a big corporation backing them to get their content out there. So a few quid a month, you could record it, say, in your living room or in your bedroom, wherever you might be, and stick it online. And if people listen to it, great. You know, exactly. And that's always felt about it. But
it has changed, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
But I think, so going back to what I was saying before, I think the one thing even back then that I was aware was that the British podcasts were just making conversations for people to listen to. The American podcasts, and I'm sort of generalizing incredibly, but it seemed to me that if you were an American podcast, you were trying to make a radio show, and if you're a British podcast, you were just trying to record a conversation. And I always preferred the British ones because I just want to listen to a conversation.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think again it comes down to that different. It's that different style of. I've always think like American or North American ones. It's a bit more, like a bit more show busy.
The only one that's different is Radio Free Skaro.
Yeah,
they're like a British podcast with American accents, and that's why I think they're so successful, because you get the best of both worlds, right? Exactly.
Well, they're part of the Commonwealth, JR. So
yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, so no, I totally agree. There has been some others I've listened to. I've got a more of you say, that conversational style, but no, there is that thing. It seems it's got to be sort of slick and polished, and you know, and that's certainly not my middle name.
No, a lot of them do that thing of leaning into the microphone that just kind of gives me a bit of a headache, frankly.
Yeah. So it's but what was your now sort of like, what was your, I mean, when you think back, when you sort of started out, you say you didn't want to get into podcasting. When you did, and you sort of got your feet under the table, what were your sort of intentions for the podcast? Did you want to take it in a particular direction? Because with Strangers in Space now, you're mixing it up quite a bit, aren't you?
It's something very different, yeah.
Yeah.
No, back then, because I was asked to do it, I didn't have an intention, because I was just, and I had no idea, hadn't listened to any podcasts either.
Yeah.
And actually, when they asked me to do it and I said yes, that's when I bought an MP3 player and started downloading podcasts, and then I started to listen to them.
Yeah.
So I only started listening to podcasts either a week before or a week after we actually made our first ones.
Okay.
So years and years and years and years ago, I read a quote. I think it was Jeremy Bentham, and I think it was in the InVision magazine. And the thing he said was, InVision magazine was going to look at the whys and wherefores of Doctor Who, story by story, on the basis that nobody ever sets out to make a bad Doctor Who story. Sometimes that just happens. So that it's not that there aren't bad Doctor Who stories, but nobody ever sits down and says, I'm going to make a rubbish film. I'm going to write a rubbish book. I'm going to make a rubbish episode of a television program. Yeah. Everybody goes into things with the best intentions.
Right.
And Bentham said that the intention of InVision magazine was to look at every story on its own merits. And if it fell short of those merits, then they'd try and understand the reasons why.
Yeah.
And that stuck with me. Even though that was about Doctor Who, that stuck with me about everything I've ever watched or read or listened to since. If there's a band I don't like, I just say, okay, that's not for me. Probably other people like it. And even if other people don't like it, then the people who made those records did so with good intentions.
Yeah.
And somehow those records have just fallen short of what they might have been. And what are the reasons why? So I guess that's a long way round of answering the question. With the podcast, what I wanted to do was to be a sort of reasonable voice, looking at everything that we liked and everything that we didn't like, and trying to understand it rather than just moan about it.
I know. Yeah, I understand where you're coming from, because I think my and I've got to be perfectly honest, my intentions, right? Okay, I wanted loads of listeners, loads of feedback, in sort of engaging with people. And I think at the time when we started podcasting, and I set up my own Twitter handle, and Twitter was a nice, friendly place to engage with other people. It really was. Not the absolute cesspit that it's become now. And I don't know why I don't know why it's become like that. It's just become awful. I'm still there. I'm still, sort of plugging away on advertising stuff on there. But it just seemed to be nice. But even that, it never really sort of happened. That listener engagement never really sort of caught on for us at all.
Shall I tell you why? I've got a theory on that too.
Go on. Yeah.
Because when you listen to a podcast, you're on your way to work, or you're on your way from work, or you're at work, or you're doing something, you're doing the housework, you're in the kitchen, you're cooking. Nobody ever listens to a podcast sitting down in the armchair, ready to reply. And throughout the entire conversation, as a listener, you're thinking, oh, I would have said that. Oh, I think this. Oh, I must remember to email them afterwards and say such and such. And then as soon as you finish that podcast, you either start the next one, or you start work, or you move on to the next thing. And all the best of intentions have disappeared before you're in front of your emails.
I know. I think you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I must admit, I mean, I hands up to perfectly honest, I'm fairly thin-skinned when it comes to that kind of thing. And I know I shouldn't be, because we had a conversation some weeks ago, didn't we? It shouldn't really matter, really. And you say, if you put yourself out in the public sphere, then you've got to take the rough with the smooth. I think at the moment.
And also, you've got to remember, because I think you've also got to remember, just on that point, that people, generally speaking, will only write in if they disagree. Because if they agree with you, what are they going to say? Oh, I agree with you.
And that's it.
Well, nobody's going to sit down and compose an email that says, oh, I agree with you. They're only going to write in if they disagree, right?
Yeah,
so
that's it.
You kind of got to expect that too.
Actually, coming on to that, what can you, when you got your first sort of iTunes review or whatever, do you remember that? Your sort of your first good one or your first bad one as well?
We had good ones.
Yeah, same here.
At first,
yeah.
And then they started to get, and then there were some of them there was one guy, and this is more recent, but this is an example of the kind of thing that you can get.
Yeah.
There was a guy who would talk about me in his reviews of all the other podcasts he listened to.
I think I know who you're talking about, because he dropped a similar review on our iTunes page as well. Yeah.
Did that mention me?
Yes, it did.
Why would you do that?
I don't know.
What?
I think the same individual was doing it on Twitter as well. And in the end, I ended up.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. And in the end, I ended up blocking him, because I just thought, I can't be bothered with listening to this blocking up my feed all day long.
It was so odd.
That was weird. I think the first bad review we had, and it still makes me chuckle thinking about it, because I put it up on our Facebook group. No one's missed the point I was trying to make. I thought it was funny. Yeah. I thought it was really funny we got a bad review, because we made this person so angry they couldn't type properly.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So so it ended up with basically what they didn't like was Paul and I just sort of having a little mucking about at the beginning before we got down to it. And obviously this some people take Doctor Who far too seriously. It's the same with any kind of fandom. It's their life. It's they pour their heart and soul into it. And what they don't like sometimes is other people, what they call as so-called fans, being flippant about it. But anyway, they typed it out. He said they think they're hilarious was meant to be, and when and they was meant to be the next, but it all came out as one word. So it was come out as hilarious Andy. So it came out. So that became a bit of a running joke with us because he was now a personal friend of the show, hilarious Andy. So yes, but that's the thing. I thought it was hilarious. I thought, well, at least we've got a reaction out of someone, good or bad. I don't really care. We've made an impression on someone, you know.
We used to get a fair few saying it's a decent podcast, but that JR talks too much. I don't have been, okay.
Surely that's the point of a podcast. Otherwise, it's just dead air. You know. It's,
and the other thing is, I am guilty of that. But see. Okay, let's talk about the format because the way I like to do it, is I like to, because I tell you what, I still don't like pressing record. I hate the red button.
Okay.
I'm terrified of being live on a podcast, recording a podcast. I don't like it. I never have liked it. I didn't go into it intentionally. And I used to play in bands when I was younger and I always had stage fright. And there were a couple of gigs where I was the keyboard player.
Yeah.
I actually stuck the keyboard behind the amp stack so that nobody could see me and I couldn't see anybody else.
Wow.
And I have the same thing about podcasting. I mean, I've been doing it so long now, it's kind of second nature to do it.
Yeah.
But one thing I hit on straight away was, if I went in with a catchphrase, at least I'd be talking. And then whatever happened after that, at least I'd have started.
Yeah.
So that was why I invented the "so you don't have to" thing, because I thought it was quite a funny little catchphrase to get us underway. And then the way I've always done it since then is, instead of going in and just asking the co-hosts what they think of something, because that kind of puts them on the spot.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's appropriate to sort of put your co-host on the spot instantly as you're starting a podcast. I think you need to warm the ground. So generally speaking, the way I do it, and this is why I get accused of talking too much, is I start the podcast, I throw some ideas out there, and then I ask the co-hosts what they think of what I've said. So I'll be talking for 2 or 3 minutes before I even open it up to everybody else.
Yeah.
But hopefully in that 2 or 3 minutes, I've given them plenty of different ideas to get their teeth into, and then they can come back with a response to whatever it is in what I've said that has struck them as the kind of thing they want to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a good way of doing it because, as you say, you can't just sort of sit someone down and just go, right, Doctor Who then, and off you go.
Exactly.
You've got to, ask them a few questions, about, what they've been doing lately, or it's just maybe just doing a little bit of research ahead of who you're talking to. Really, if you've got like a guest on, for argument's sake, it's just basically trying to do your homework a little bit, and you ease them into, and sometimes you get stuff you don't expect to come out of them as well. Just by making them feel at ease. Yeah.
Well, that's why I like to throw lots of ideas out. Because generally speaking, it'll be the same people I podcast with every week. But I'll know what the subject is, and I'll know. I never have a plan, and I never have notes. But I always know I always have a general idea of what the first thing I'm going to say is, because then I know. Going back to what I was saying before, then I know that at least we're talking.
Yes. That's right. Yeah, because I think there's nothing worse than you sort of like you ramble off for like 2 or 3 minutes and you get like a yes, no. Kind of exactly. You've got to get their sort of creative juices going as well. But when obviously you've interviewed people quite often because you've had Starburst, but also sort of what we've been doing sort of like Desert Island Who, for argument's sake. You were sort of getting stories out of people. You've been interviewing recently Dr. Robert from the Blow Monkeys as well. So so that's sort of diversified somewhat, but who's been your, at the moment, so who's been your sort of crowning glory when you say that's the person I most wanted to interview, really?
Oh, well, Dr. Robert, clearly.
Yeah.
Because that goes back to when that was like one of the first records I ever bought, was their first album, The Blow Monkeys. But I tell you what, Andrew Cartmel recently. No, Andrew Cartmel was one that a lot of people responded to. I tell you what, Chris Chibnall, I interviewed. This was for the magazine rather than on the podcast. And Matthew Jacobs I interviewed, also for the magazine rather than on the podcast.
Yeah.
And I went back and interviewed Matthew Jacobs but here's the thing, at the time, neither of them had done really interviews. Chris Chibnall had done interviews about things that he was currently doing, but he'd never done an interview that wasn't just a promotional interview. And I think I just emailed him. I just happened to find out that he lived close enough that I could drive to see him.
Yeah.
And I knew he didn't give many interviews, but I just completely, apropos of nothing, just sent him a message on Twitter, I think, and said, look, you don't live too far away. Do you fancy doing a sort of career encompassing interview where instead of talking about the latest thing that you want to promote, we just talk about the stuff we've done? Gives you a chance to sort of like have a more relaxed form of interview where you're not constantly having to promote. And he'd never done anything like that before, and he agreed to it, and we did it. And he was the loveliest bloke I've ever interviewed. And at the end, it was supposed to be 60 minutes. At the end of 2.5 hours, where he'd missed lunch, and in the end only had to dash off because he had a dentist's appointment. So he went to the dentist. He went to the dentist on an empty stomach. And this was just before Broadchurch was due. The first series was due to broadcast. So he literally came to meet me while he was still in the middle of a meeting online with the heads of ITV about when and where Broadchurch was going to be broadcast. Anyway, at the end of the interview, he said to me, that was really lovely. He said, I've never had a chance to do that before, and I'll never have to do it again because I've done it with you. And this one would just be, if somebody says to me, do you want to talk about such and such? I'll just say, go and read that interview there because I did it.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah.
But the Matthew Jacobs one's even more interesting because Doctor Who fandom hadn't found him.
Okay.
I was looking to do something for the anniversary. This was in 2013. And I wanted to do a different bit for each of the decades that Doctor Who had been on. And for the 1990s, all you had was the TV movie. And Philip Seagull had spoken to it ad infinitum. Matthew Jacobs never had. And I thought, well, he's got to be around somewhere. Somebody must know where he is. So I looked him up online, found a website. There was a contact thing. And I said, Matthew, do you want to talk about Doctor Who for the anniversary for Starburst magazine? Yeah. And he was like, oh, okay, yeah. And then since then, now he does conventions and he's done his Doctor Who Am I thing and all that. And I like to think that all started with me finding him, Googling him online and finding him and sort of getting him out of his sort of drawing him out of his burrow, so to speak.
Burrow, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I think
what about you?
My first interview for the podcast was because I think obviously you want to talk to your heroes or talk to people involved in the production of Doctor Who. So my first interview was with Dominic Glynn. Actually, I just approached him out of the blue on Twitter, and it took a while, bit of to and fro, because I think it's his schedule, trying to sort of fit in with his schedule. And he was perfect. He was lovely. He really was lovely. He answered all my silly questions. But one thing I've done, and I've kind of stuck to all the people I've interviewed, I've got no notes in front of me, nothing at all. I try and make it more like a conversation rather than an interview. So I might think of something to get it started with, but then after that, it's just a conversation and try and let it just go in whatever direction it's going to go in.
Yeah, same.
Yeah. So he was great. He was absolutely great. But I think my crowning glory, my favourite one I've done, and I had no preparation for it whatsoever. I had half hour's notice, was interviewing Philip Hinchcliffe.
Yeah.
In the same room, which was that was amazing, because he's one of my heroes. He's from my favourite period of Doctor Who. So to talk to the guy who made it happen, it was a dream come true, and I was incredibly nervous. But my kicker, or the kickoff for that, was the fact that I'd spoken to him briefly at Gallifrey 1 earlier that year. Because he was a guest there, and I was on the same flight as him, and on the same shuttle bus, and I stood behind him in the queue to check in at the hotel desk. and we accused each other of following one another, just sort of jokingly. And that's
say jokingly.
Jokingly, I know exactly. But he's a very, very intimidating guy, and I thought I thought we're going to get about half an hour with him, and we went on for over an hour talking, and it got to the point where he's because it was at a convention, the convention handler said, "Sorry, you've got to go on stage now." So Rich had to cut it short for him to go on stage and probably go through the same questions all over again. But that was a lot of fun. It was nerve wracking. It certainly got the old adrenaline going.
This is the thing about the people from behind the scenes, because in Doctor Who we see so many and read so many and hear so many interviews with people behind the scenes that we think is normal, but actually in everyday life it's usually the front of screen talent that does all the promotion, and the sort of behind the scenes people, they don't get so many opportunities to talk, and they generally are lovely people because they're not the ones with the ego and the ambition generally.
No, that's right. Do you know, I think that's really a modern thing, because I mean, back in the like you said, like the 1970s, you knew who the stars were of all the TV series. You didn't know who the writers were, you didn't know the producers were, nobody cared. No. But now that's become a thing, and I don't know if that is in part due to podcasts where people want to get people on just to talk about their favorite show, or just involved in it in some shape or form. So I'd like to think that sort of podcasts is sort of help those behind the scenes people sort of come to the forefront. You might know directors, for argument's sake, of movies, but certainly not directors of TV shows. No. I mean, it's sort of like Graham Harper. He's a legend. He's an absolute legend. But could you have named him all those years ago? No,
probably not.
No. It's very much a modern thing. So I do think podcasts have sort of brought those people to the forefront. I think, and quite rightly so, because they're the ones who make it happen. They make the actors look good, or whoever it is, or presenters. What make them look good.
Yeah, podcasts and blogs and just the internet in general as well, to a degree.
Yeah.
Because I think it's just given so much more. Because back in, say, when we were kids or whatever, older kids rather than younger kids, when we first started getting into this stuff, if you wanted to read interviews with or find out more about something you liked, as for example Doctor Who, really, you had the Doctor Who magazine. And if you were lucky and could find a shop that would sell these kinds of stuff, like a sci-fi collector's shop or something, the occasional fanzine, but they were fairly few and far between.
Exactly.
Not easy to find. So there wasn't that much room. Nowadays, with the internet, there's all these websites and everything else as well. There's a lot more room for all this stuff. And actually, that sort of brings us on to another subject for this sort of conversation about podcasts. Because the thing is, as well, you and I, sort of both do sort of general podcasts. Yeah. But I noticed after we started, there was a fashion for much more specific areas for podcasts to go into. So now, for example, some podcasts will do the journey, and they'll start at An Earthly Child, and their journey will be they'll review the whole of Doctor Who in order. But then what I mean really is that there's podcasts about the Virgin New Adventures, and there's podcasts about Big Finish, and there's podcasts about particular rangers at Big Finish, or particular strands of this, that and the other. Didn't Paul Cornell do a podcast about just the Third Doctor?
I think he did. Ago. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. I mean,
that's crazily specific.
Oh no, and a very short sort of shelf life as well. Actually, once you reach the end of that era, that's it. You're done. Maybe that was the intention. It's one and done, and that's it. I think that's the thing. If you find I think the important things when you're setting out a podcast, I think, is to find your niche of what you want to do. We did, but as you say, we've both evolved over the years. And I'm watching the clock, so I do have a sort of like a time limit on today. But
maybe we can do a part 2 of this.
Maybe we do a part. Maybe we should do. Yeah.
Let's talk about our diversification in a couple of weeks, because that's quite too big a subject to do in a handful of minutes.
I think it is, actually, because obviously, to give a hint, what's going to come in part 2 is the fact that we're doing YouTube stuff as well. We've branched into other areas. We're not just doing Doctor Who. We're doing other things as well. Hence, like today's conversation. This is nothing to do with Doctor Who, really. This is more about, podcasting. But I think the one thing I do want to sort of touch upon before we talk about diversification in the next episode is how it's changed over the years. Because as I said, I always found it was for the, I said it's for the amateur. I always felt it was our outlet, really.
Yeah. Well, I think this might be a conversation for next week too, because this is quite a big conversation as well.
It is, because I think I'm good for another sort of 10 minutes. So let's see how we go. We might have to continue it.
All right.
Yeah, but what I've seen over the years is you've got a lot of sort of podcast shows made by the production companies responsible for those shows. So for argument's sake, you then had and this one really irked me at the time, was the Doctor Who fan show.
Oh yeah.
Now I'll tell you why it irked me, because how can it be a fan show if it's made
BBC,
by the BBC? Exactly. That really I've got nothing against the presenters, Crystal D or anyone else involved in it. It was just the fact that it was also the jumping on the bandwagon. Now BBC have got multiple podcasts out there now.
I think, see, my philosophy is it's fair enough. I think, because if you go back to, say, punk, let's go back and take punk as a sort of analogy. At the start of punk, you just had a bunch of people in the late 70s who were fed up with what was going on in society around them, who didn't know how to play musical instruments, but liked music. And so just did their own thing. And podcasting is it started with the sort of, not the birth of the internet, but with the beginnings of ubiquity of the internet. And it was people who had something to say, had never had a platform to say it, and were now finding they had a platform to talk about those things. But just like punk, as soon as something starts to become successful, then everybody else says, oh, actually, it's not, let's jump on. I don't think of it as jumping on the bandwagon. I think of it as recognizing the value in something and then finding the place where you think you can bring something to it.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you, but again, it comes back to that difference between, as you say, a podcast and a radio show. Yeah, because I think a lot of the time that the podcast it is just an extension. Because I have seen radio show presenters having their own podcasts. Why do you need both platforms? Really, that's the thing I can't quite get my head around. But I'll give you an example. It's quite a weird example. My father, he used to be a very big model maker, and he used to like doing radio controlled boats and stuff like that. And he built them all from scratch. So, and I remember seeing all the stuff in his shed. He'd be building like the bulkheads of a boat, and then he'd be steaming wood to make it to bend. Yeah, he really went into it. But there was a few other guys used to meet at Chislehurst Ponds, and they'd be sailing their boats on a Sunday morning. When I was a kid, I used to go along as well, and he might let me have a go before I crashed it into the bank or whatever. But then they started doing radio controlled tanks. Okay, so and again, this guy, he got it to go backwards and forwards. There was a little model shop quite close to where we live. This guy came and said, I've made this. Can I get it to go backwards and forwards? My dad designed a gearbox so it could turn left and right. And it was made out of old brass cogs and bits of Meccano. It really was like homemade stuff. And they would go up into like overgrown school kids up on Chislehurst Common having little tank battles. And now one morning, this guy was walking his dog, and he thought this is the best thing he'd ever seen. And he worked for Marlborough. Now people think to us we've been sponsored by a tobacco company, but this was the 1970s. Okay. So this guy said, right, well, would you want to do some like sort of army open day shows, like putting a little tank battle shows and stuff like that? And they did quite a few of them. They were sponsored by Marlborough. They got them there, and they did these little sort of mock battles and stuff. But that's it. It was a lot of fun. But then this guy from Marlborough said, right, what we want you to do now, we want you to build this. And my dad was like, no, you're not telling me what to build. Right? Because this, and that's the point I'm trying to get to. It's the corporations think this is a good thing. We want in on the action. And they'd gradually start to take it over. And my dad just went, no, I'm not having any part of this. You're not telling me what to build, because it's fun. It's meant to be fun. And I'll build what I want to build. But here's the sting in the tail. A few months later, one of the guys that he used to do the Model Tanks film on Sunday morning, used to live opposite my nan and granddad. He got onto Nationwide. They did a little piece, and my dad missed his chance to get on the telly.
Well,
so there you go. There's the sting in the tail. But it's
that's it.
Yeah, that's it.
Now, I've been on newscast on the BBC.
Oh, right.
So I can't complain. You can't get me to complain about BBC podcasting. I've been on one.
You've been on one. But that's in a very tortuous way I put that across. It's that it starts out as a little amateur thing, a hobby that's fun, and then eventually it's sort of like the bigger people come along and start to try and take it over. And I think that was the point I was trying to not take it over. They want in on the action, and all of a sudden you look at the podcast, and that's the other thing. If you look at the iTunes charts now, we don't scratch it at all. We've done once or twice. We never really bothered it.
But that's it. When I first started, people said keep your eye on the iTunes chart. You'll get in there. And I didn't even think about it. And then one day I remembered after we'd been doing it for a few months, and I looked, and sure enough, there we were.
Yeah.
And so for a couple of weeks afterwards, I looked, and sure enough, there we were again. And then I kind of lost interest. And you're right. These days, we wouldn't be in there at all.
No.
But a
lot of it is made up of the big corporation podcast. Yeah. Which is.
And I agree with you that it's kind of a shame. But at the same time, I'm like philosophical about it because, of course that happened. So you just find your niche, find your audience.
And stay with it. Yeah, exactly.
And live with what everybody else is doing because, of course, that was going to happen. And it did happen. Yeah. It's not a surprise.
No, exactly.
Every now and again, I'll wake up and I'll think, oh, God, because I shouldn't say the numbers, but we went from about 2,000 listeners to about 200 listeners. So we've lost 90% of our listenership, right?
Yeah.
And every now and again, I'll wake up and I'll think, oh, God, where did those 90% of our listeners go?
Yeah.
But look at what's happened to Doctor Who on the television. When Russell T Davies brought it back, it got 7.5 million viewers on average a week for the first 5 years. Because there were still only 5 terrestrial channels. Yes. And all the digital channels were just showing repeats.
That's right. Yeah.
But then Sky did more programming, brought more channels in.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got Netflix started programming and started making their own stuff. Amazon Prime started making stuff. All these streamers. In 2010, I think it is, smart TVs rolled out onto the market. And when smart TVs rolled out on the market, you had a button on your remote control that said YouTube, and another one that said Netflix, and another one that says something else. And all of a sudden, you can watch YouTube through your telly.
Yeah.
And you can watch Netflix through your telly without having to download anything or do weird stuff. It's just there on your remote control. And so Doctor Who's average audience has gone from 7.5 million to 4.5 million. Because people are just finding it really easy to do other things.
Yes.
And to me, being a podcaster in the 2020s, it's not that all these other podcasts have come in and stolen your listeners. Of course they have, really. But what's happened is the BBC podcasts are the Netflix of podcasting.
Exactly. Yeah. That's a very, very good example, and it happens with everything. It really does. Eventually, it gets overtaken or swallowed up into a larger organism, really, doesn't it? So it's the nature of the beast, really. You
just have to sort of say, well, that's the way things went. But as long as we do still have listeners, and as long as people like what you're doing, appreciate what you're doing, and you might not get going back to the start of our conversation, you might not get too many emails, but you do still get some. When I say emails, I mean messages or whatever on social media, replies and responses and likes and whatever. As long as you haven't run out of those altogether, then you're not doing it entirely into a vacuum.
No, exactly. But obviously, I think before we go any further, I think it's a pretty opportune time to end part one of this conversation, because I think we're next going to get into the diversification of our podcast. Now we've gone from audio to video as well. and maybe the sort of reasons why we did that. So it's been great chatting about this, Joe. It's been I think some interesting viewpoints put across from both sides there, I think, actually. So it was good, and no dead air. That's the important thing.
And there's only two of us. It's really easy to get dead air when there's only two people.
No, that was great. So we'll pick this up in a couple of weeks or so then. Yes. So until then, everybody, it's goodbye from me, Phil.
And it's goodbye from him, Phil.
Yes, bye-bye.